Thanks for tuning in once again, folks. You are warmly welcome to the opening bell with me, Alex Steedman, and Matt Christie. Lots coming up on this week's show. We celebrate Bivol, one of the most talented and best boxers around right now. And unlike many in and around the sport, he is choosing, going forward, fighting the best over making the most money. How about that as a novel idea? Mind you, if you can do both, fantastic. And hopefully Bivol has already done one and now he's looking to do the other. We're going to speak about Bivol's performance against Ramirez, the rest of the action from that bill, and this weekend in Manchester on Sky, Dalton Smith against Casey Benjamin in a British title fight. And Denzel Bentley gets one of the toughest assignments on the international stage as well. And we celebrate one of, if not perhaps Manny Pacquiao's greatest nights in this week. Lots going on in the sport. Matt Christie, how are you?
I'm good. I'm looking forward to this weekend. Don't know how I'm going to keep abreast of everything because there's just so much going on. I think you've got televised fight cards on Friday, Saturday evening in Manchester in this country. Then we've got Las Vegas where Denzel Bentley in the early hours of Sunday morning. So there's a lot to keep abreast of. Boxing, as we said last week, no matter what's going on in the background, boxing will just keep rolling on and rolling on and rolling on. And admittedly, there's more than one or two fights this weekend that I'm really looking forward to.
And these days, when you watch the fights, how much of it, because, let's be honest, there is nothing like watching a sport live. And when I say live, obviously there's nothing like being there. But oftentimes these days you're better served by watching it from home in terms of the coverage. But the next best thing is watching it as it unfolds. How much of your sport are you actually able to watch live, particularly with the overnight international stuff? And how much do you find you have to catch up on?
I will tend to things that kind of are taking place in that suit my body clock. I will watch them. I think I've got a little bit older now. I mean, if it's a big fight, I will always now. I no longer stay up. As much as I see people on Twitter banging on about the fact that they can barely open their eyes, but look at me, I'm watching the fight live. Yeah, well, good for you, but you'll feel it on Sunday. I know how that feels. So yeah, I will always get a kip, and then I'll drag myself up and watch a really, really big one. But there's always other people covering it. If I'm having to cover it for the site or whatever else, I'll watch it live. But otherwise, no, I will watch it first thing on a Sunday morning, and I will do my very best to keep myself away from social media before I've seen the result.
Yeah, I would say 9 times out of 10 I do these days as well. I think Lomachenko against Teo Lopez might have been the last one, or was it? It might have been Canelo against Bivol as well, where I got up or stayed up. But more times than not these days, I'll just avoid everything and get up first thing on Sunday and watch it. But it doesn't quite feel the same, does it? As when you watch it at the time when it's unfolding. For somehow, although it really shouldn't matter, it does seem to taste and feel differently.
Oh, completely. Yeah, it does. It does. I think I just remember having a really bad experience when I stayed up for Tyson Fury against Tom Schwartz. I think that was the last time I actually stayed all the way through it. And you had good old Joe Joyce doing the TV analyst job alongside John Fury, which was entertaining, surreal, bizarre, but just the way that I felt afterwards was something else. After staying up all night long to watch that, it may have been the fact that Fury Schwartz was not quite classic, but no, I think in an ideal world you do drag yourself up. But the problem is with a night like in terms of this weekend, for example, you can be up till 11 or 12 watching the fights that are taking place in this country, and then the next lot are going to start at 2 or 3. That's when it becomes difficult to then say, okay, well, I'm going to have a kip for an hour and then get up. That's when you have to make some difficult decisions.
Sleep deprivation, there is nothing quite like it, is there? And yet, I think a lot of that stuff is mindset. I mean, my wife is one of the worst for going to bed early, or the best in my case, because I get to I get absolute free reign with the TV and the stick and Netflix and whatever. But when we go to Ibiza, her mindset's slightly different, and we're not going out till 12:30, 1 a.m. for a night's clubbing, and somehow she can do that, and yet barely can she get beyond 9 o'clock without having to go to bed Monday to Friday back here in the UK. So I think mindset is maybe part of it. You won't have to stay up late for Eubank against Liam Smith. We teased that, didn't we, around the time that the Conor Benn fight spectacularly fell out of bed. We did tease the possibility that we'd heard Liam Smith was in the pipeline. And December 17th, I saw Roy Jones' interview just the other day. December 17th has been muted, and Roy Jones saying that he is going to be part of Eubank's training team once again.
Yeah, we return to some sort of normality, don't we? I think it's a really good fight. I think there's no secret that Liam Smith came over and signed with Sky Sports and Ben Shalom on the understanding that he would get the fight with Chris Eubank Jr. Then, of course, the Conor Benn fight came out of left field slightly, and Liam Smith was put on the back burner. But he gets his chance now. I think it's a fight that Liam Smith deserves. I think it's a fight that importantly, Liam Smith can win. Really good domestic clash between two world-class fighters. And at the moment, I'm not going to sit here and say I think Chris Eubank Jr. is going to win it. I think you could make a really strong case for Liam Smith winning that fight.
I think it could be a good fight too. That is a great fight. And I wouldn't be surprised if there's a slight personality clash in the build up to it as well. I wouldn't be surprised. On a sour note, Matt, we must mention the news that Kazakh fighter Aidos Yerbossynuly, who lost by late stoppage to David Morrell last weekend in Indianapolis. That was a super middleweight title fight. He lost that fight. And having the fight been stopped by the referee, he actually staggered against the ropes, and credit to Morrell. Morrell basically gave him a shoulder to lean on and helped him back to his corner. Subsequently, he collapsed and was taken to hospital and has been placed in an induced coma. So, worrying news filtering through from stateside. What do you know?
The media has just been told basically to show a bit of respect and give the family some space, and that's quite understandable. As far as I'm aware, Yerbossynuly is in a really critical condition. In hospital, he was put into an induced coma, and it was one of those fights we mentioned before about getting up in the morning and watching one, and that's what I did. And okay, it wasn't a 12-round one-sided hammering, but it became increasingly uncomfortable to watch. It became abundantly clear from about round 7 and 8 that there was only going to be one winner. You don't want to throw the corner under the bus. You don't want to throw the referee under the bus, but you do. I think we're right to question the mindset of a lot of people in boxing, in that the corner have admitted that the fighter had said that he wanted to get to the final bell. The lead corner man wanted him to get to the final bell. There was the assistant coach had the towel in his hand at the time of the stoppage. The fact that the towel's in the hand in the first place should be bothersome. We've already got to a point where your instincts are telling you to stop the fight. And I think it is this fighter's need and want for survival. Get to the final bell. I won't lose any face. I'll retain all pride. I've got to get to the final bell at all costs. That we think perhaps we might need a rethink. I understand it as much as I possibly can from a fighter's point of view why that is the case. And in the heat of battle, that is all they will be focused on. They don't want to lose by stoppage. But when it becomes apparent that the fight is no longer winnable, I think we have to ask the question, should the fight just automatically be stopped? Now, I know we now and again have these 1 in a million fairy tale finishes, but the fact that it is 1 in a million suggests that we can probably live without them if we also make the sport a little bit safer. Because you can count on one hand the amount of these fairy tale finishes that we've witnessed, but you'd need many, many, many more hands for the amount of times that fights have occurred where that punch doesn't happen, where it ends and the one fighter's won every single round and it's been a bit of a beating. It did become uncomfortable. I didn't enjoy watching it. And our thoughts and prayers are with him. It was a very, very brave effort. But the fact, I think, you go back and you look at the 12th round, watch that 12th round in its entirety, and he's gone down early on from not the hardest shot in the world, and he's up and he's blinking, and he's blinking, and he's blinking, and he's blinking. Then he's just holding on. Then he's hauled off Morrell, and Tony Weeks takes a point away because all he can do is hold on. Why the fight continued for as long as it did, I'm not sure. Very difficult to blame, as I say, very difficult to blame a referee. When a fighter is now and again showing signs of recovery. Very difficult to blame a corner when we're not privy to conversations that they've shared behind the scenes. Never stop a fight that I'm in. Never let me see the final bell. But ultimately, I think it does speak of a problem that we've spoke of before in the sport, where when a fighter is pulled out or when a fighter pulls out of his own accord, it automatically becomes he's a quitter. And I think it's that narrative that we do need to work to change. And
I should stress that Matt watched the fight back in the first thing on Sunday morning, not knowing the fact that Yerbossynuly had collapsed and been taken to hospital, or had been taken to hospital and then placed into an induced coma. So he watched the fight through the prism of just watching the fight, not knowing what subsequently happened. So in other words, unlike me, who went back and watched, I've watched portions of it, highlights of it, I've not watched it all through, but I watched that knowing the news that he was in a coma. So there's no doubt that does perhaps colour and affect the way that you watch it. So Matt has gone back and watched that completely neutrally, and so his reaction comes from that standpoint. And just, I suppose, very briefly, it does extend conversations that we had largely out of the Daniel Dubois-Joe Joyce fight. I think, about a year and a half ago, when Dubois effectively pulled himself out of the fight. And let's recall the criticism that stirred up from fighters in particular, named leading fighters like, David Hay and Carl Frampton, verbally critical of Dubois and what unfolded there. I think Matt Macklin might have been one of the fighters too, and I'm not calling them out. I'm just giving an example of high-profile fighters who reacted in a certain way to what it was that Dubois did on that night. You'll recall, in another way, fans very, very critical of Joe Gallagher in that Marcus Morrison fight. You may recall quite a few years ago now, when Morrison was kind of beaten and seemingly battered. Those are examples for different reasons where fans have been quite critical in their approach to a fight being stopped. There are so many cases, Matt, and it raises lots of issues about where the responsibility lies. Really, we're going to talk about Pacquiao against Margarito from this week in 2010, a dozen years ago. That is as one-sided a fight as you are likely to see. And Margarito, visibly damaged in that fight. And you did have a discussion throughout that fight, which we'll come to a bit later on, between the HBO commentary team, one of whom happened to be Emmanuel Stewart. And the great Emmanuel Stewart, he's saying, well, on the one hand, you can't stop the fight, or the referee can't stop the fight, because Margarito keeps coming forward and he keeps throwing punches. But then, on the other hand, a round or so later, Emmanuel Stewart said, but I'd have absolutely no complaints at all if the referee stops this fight right now. So again, it comes down to who's the responsibility, and should they work together more, or should ultimately the responsibility lie with with someone more than someone else? Should there be checkpoints as the fight goes on between the referee and between the corner? And of course, like Dubois, there is a fighter's responsibility, which most of the fighters just plainly ignore, partly because of who they are, and partly because of the culture that they've been brought up in, and partly because of that culture that created reactions from people like Carl Frampton, David Hay and Matt Macklin on that night with Dubois. That's about the culture of the fighters, the culture of the sport as well. So there's a lot interwoven in this story, and this is another sad tale that kind of brings up all of those emotions and those various strands, Matt, that are not in truth easy for you or I or anyone else to answer.
It's really difficult. As you say, it's ingrained in the sport. It's ingrained in the minds of fighters from a very young age. And it has to be, doesn't it? It sounds like a callous term, but that never say die spirit is what drives them forward. What makes them who they are. So it's going to take a pretty seismic change, really, a seismic shift to get people to look at things differently from a more human point of view. Because anybody that follows boxing will say that boxers, what they do, what they put themselves through, they are superhuman. We're in awe of them, but there's a limit. Nobody is invincible. There's a limit to the amount of punishment we can take, and we saw it in stark reality in the early hours of Sunday morning. The commentary team, interestingly, were not screaming for the fight to be stopped. This wasn't an absolute travesty that it wasn't stopped. But for people that know boxing, it did genuinely, or to me at least, it just became abundantly clear that there was no way he was going to win that fight. He'd not hurt Morrell once. There was no evidence on his record going in to suggest that he could turn that fight around. He hadn't fought at that level before. And yes, coaches do have the power to stop a fight, but I think we have to be sympathetic with coaches as well, in that we saw it with Mark Breland. Mark Breland had the audacity to stop a fight, to pull Deontay Wilder out, and he lost his job. So there's so many different strands to this that will be going through a coach's mind when he can see the fight slowly but surely disappearing from a boxer he knows very well. But perhaps the conversation beforehand should be, or a coach's mantra should be, I will do everything for you so that you win this fight. But the moment I believe it becomes unwinnable, I'm stopping it. Rather than a fighter dictating that conversation and saying, don't you dare stop this fight. But it's difficult, isn't it? On this podcast, we always try and be as honest as possible and look at things in an ideal world. We can't really have any say over what kind of conversations happen between fighter and coach behind the scenes. But I think as we move forward in time, that I think we need to be a little bit wary of how this sport looks. And as much as I'm a massive fan of ex-boxers being on co-coms, they can see things that people have never boxed can see, particularly people that have done it at the highest level. We saw it at the weekend. Barry Jones, I thought, was absolutely sensational on co-coms at the weekend. But now and again, they don't have the sympathy, they don't have that human touch that sometimes is needed.
Well, let's hope there's a happy ending to that particular story. And I'm sure plenty of your thoughts will be with Aidos Yerbossynuly going forward. What we do know is that Dimitri Bivol is one of the best boxers on the planet. He is terrific, and he underlined it once again with just a smooth, tactical, technical, clever, authoritative performance against the previously unbeaten top 10 fighter and former world champion Gilberto Ramirez. It was an all top 5 in the rankings light heavyweight affair last weekend in Abu Dhabi, and ultimately Bivol won it convincingly by 6 points, 6 points, and 8 points on one of the scorecards. He shut down Ramirez after a tricky enough first couple of rounds, Matt. But thereafter, what Bivol produced was just a masterclass in, once again, range and distance boxing. And what really impressed me was that, having complimented Canelo for this suffocating pressure stroke presence style of his over the course of the last 3 or 4 years, Bivol is now implementing that style even better than Canelo has. And it's just incredible to watch and witness. He is an absolute master of his craft.
For the boxing connoisseur, Dimitri Bivol is just a delight, an absolute delight to watch. There is nothing hurried about what he does. How he finds the time to select the perfect shot to throw on nearly every single occasion he throws a punch is a joy to behold. The patience is there, the intelligence is there, and those feet, the way he uses his feet. Watch, if you've seen the fight already, go back and watch it again and just look at his feet through every round. He's going to be very, very difficult to beat. We've known for a long time that Bivol has the makings of a really special fighter. Some of us doubted it, myself included, after witnessing him in Manchester against Craig Richards. But on the highest stage against Canelo and now against Ramirez, he is starting to craft masterpiece after masterpiece. And as we said on the front cover of this week's Boxing News, we called him the artist. And he's just so majestic. I would struggle to pick anybody to beat him at the moment in and around his weight class, including Beterbiev.
I think Beterbiev can't beat him, which says something, given how supreme Bivol is. And it's another fighter who, well, on this occasion hadn't lost. Previous 3 fighters had only lost once. Canelo, Salamov, and Craig Richards had only lost once. His last 6 opponents, record 187 wins to 7 losses. Every time he's gone up in class, he's produced the goods and back-to-back performances of real class. And it, as you say, is the amazing thing to watch him, Matt, and it's similar to how Callum Smith described fighting Canelo, is that he's there. He's right in front of you, seemingly there to be hit, and yet when you go to hit him, and Callum Smith was saying with Canelo, he almost freezes you because there's an anxiety about throwing and not missing and then getting countered. And it's the same with Bivol. He's right there in front of you, but either his footwork will take him out of range or it'll just be a little deft slip of the shoulder and the punches will slide past his head. He is just so difficult to hit, and yet he will be right there in and around range to counter effectively, which he does again and again and again, which you said with the right sort of shots. Do you think there's his style, is it the kind of style that can be appreciated out beyond the boxing bubble?
I think it can be appreciated. Whether it can draw in millions is another matter. I think that's the difficulty that fighters like that have had throughout history. There's never any pressure on his shoulders to... If he can stay in second or third gear, he'll stay in second or third gear. He never thinks, well, I'm fighting in Las Vegas or Abu Dhabi or whatever, and thinks I'd better really put my foot down now and put on a show for the fans. He's in his own little world, doing what he needs to do to win a fight. And without the odd knockout, he may struggle to draw in millions of people. I suppose outside the ring, you could argue, has he got that charisma and has he got that X factor? Perhaps not. But I think what we want to see next, of course, and what we hope we do get is Beterbiev. And I think if he can prove himself to be the best light heavyweight in the land, I think there's ways that fighters like this can start to draw in more and more people, and as we say, cross over, go some way to transcending the sport, is when they become known as invincible. A little bit like Floyd Mayweather. And all of a sudden you become this invincible man, and then people tune in to see what all the fuss is about and see if the invincible man can be toppled. A little bit like Pernell Whitaker back in the day as well. He was another fighter where there was accusations levelled at him that he was a boring fighter. Yeah, it all just came so very naturally to him. He just did whatever was required to win a fight with barely breaking a sweat. And we may see something similar here with Bivol up at light heavyweight. The talk of fighting Canelo in a rematch at 168, yeah, I get it. I understand why Canelo would want to be in his own stomping ground. But let's not forget now that Bivol turned professional in 2014 weighing 179 pounds. He's now 31 years old. He's been a light heavyweight throughout his professional career. To drop 7 pounds and go and accommodate Canelo, I think would be a really bad idea for Bivol's development. Not saying he wouldn't go down and he wouldn't win it, but that's a heck of a lot of weight to lose. And then to ask him to jump back up to 175, when you're past the age of 30 and you're yo-yoing like that, very, very rarely does that have a positive effect on the fighter that's going through those weight crashes and weight gains. So I would just like to see Bivol, as he appears to be doing at the moment, say, nope, I'm a light heavyweight, I'm staying in the light heavyweight class, I'm going to prove I'm the best here, then we'll see what happens then. But a drop down to 168, just really to fight the superstar again, who he's already beaten handily, I think that really speaks of how unstructured boxing is and how it does kind of get away with changing the landscape and changing the rules, changing the signposts and what have you, just to fit a certain narrative. Dimitri Bivol is a light heavyweight, a bona fide light heavyweight. He's not a super middleweight. Don't drop back down in weight just to beat somebody you've already beaten. In years to come, he will be remembered for what he achieved at light heavyweight. And if he feels like he's done everything at light heavyweight that he possibly can, and if he beats Beterbiev, he probably has, perhaps there might be a Buatsi or a Callum Smith to take care of after that, then perhaps you can look at earning millions and millions against Canelo and then riding off into the sunset. But for now, his business should be in the 175-pound weight class.
And it sounds like his plan A is Beterbiev. It's so refreshing to hear him talk like that. He did say when he was interviewed, I think it was actually before the fight, regarding Beterbiev, and he said, I love money as much as anyone, but it's not the most important thing. And, the idea of fighting the best, the idea of legacy, those things appeal perhaps more to Bivol than money itself. And with that in mind, Beterbiev is very much the fighter that he wants to fight. That's Beterbiev at the moment as the champion and the holder of the other 3 belts. And that is assuming, of course, that Beterbiev fights Yard and he beats Yard in late January, which many people expect him to do and think he will do. But in this game, you never quite know. And interestingly, Matt, recent WBC convention in recent days, WBC mandating that Beterbiev, if he beats Yard, should defend against Callum Smith. There is, of course, precedence, we should say, whether you think this is sort of timing, unsuitable timing from the WBC or just coincidental. Either way, there is precedence set when there is a unification fight, which, Beterbiev against Bivol, with all the belts on the line, would take precedence over Beterbiev against Callum Smith. So even although boxing punters might see that news line and throw their hands up in the air and moan and scream, actually it might not be as concerning as you first think.
No, not at all. And I think the WBC have been a sanctioning body that have always been open to, and I don't like the word, but unification fights, creating the undisputed. And I think you have to welcome that. And I think they're right at the same time to say, well, okay, that may not happen. These fights don't always happen. These fights in the men's code rarely happen. Not so much in recent years, admittedly, but since the 90s, it's very rare that you get the undisputed fight. So if that doesn't happen, then it's going to have to be Callum Smith next. And that's perfectly understandable, I think. And you look at the light heavyweight rankings, and I think there is Callum Smith and there's Buatsi. But then after that, should whoever emerges victorious from, fingers crossed, the fight between Beterbiev and Bivol, who else is there? Of course, I'm being very cruel on Anthony Yard there. But you do wonder, will they want to stick around in the light heavyweight division? Or will they want to then move on or move down? And something else while we're on Bivol that I think is really impressive and people need to remember is that he came off a career best performance against Canelo, probably earned a career high in terms of his purse. And he has quite clearly retained his focus on the sport. Now and again we see these fighters come along, they cause these massive upsets, and they're a different fighter in their next fight. Their focus has been turned to all the temptations that being a very, very rich individual can offer. Bivol is showing no signs of that at all, and his post-fight address in regards to Beterbiev seems to say, I am focused on boxing and I am focused on being the very best that I can possibly be, and right now that means me beating Beterbiev, and that's really, really welcome.
Absolutely. It's refreshing. It's fantastic to hear. It's kind of the stuff that we expect or hope for from our sporting idols, isn't it? It's exactly the kind of attitude and mantras you expect or want to hear from your sporting idols. And Bivol very much fits the bill as a kind of sporting hero, doesn't he? And just going back to your kind of the comment about the style, or the question that I asked you regarding your style, I actually think that the last two fights, Bivol's taken his style and his performances to a new level. So while I think you might have appreciated Bivol before, similar to the manner in which we probably appreciated rather than enjoyed Floyd Mayweather towards the tail end of his career, I think now I'm really enjoying Bivol. Dominant performances back to back. And he threw a lot of punches against Ramirez. He was attacking as much as he can. And I really liked the performance as well as appreciating the style. Just a couple of other news lines coming out of that WBC convention, Matt. And I don't know how this sits with two Russians based in America, North America, fighting for the WBC title. But isn't there a newsline that they're going to Russian boxers are going to be taken out of the rankings?
There is a newsline, yeah. I think it's any boxer that fights out of Russia or Belarus and represents Russia or Belarus will be removed from the WBC rankings. Of course, with the case of Bivol and Beterbiev, they're both based elsewhere. And this, through really, for a long time, Beterbiev, if you look at his nationality, it's Canadian. It's not a new thing. Whether the WBC would have made that decision if both Beterbiev and Bivol were fighting out of Russia and representing Russia, I don't know. The cynical may say no, they wouldn't. But ultimately, they've made that call. It's a really difficult one in terms of whether you agree with it or not, whether you're punishing athletes that probably have nothing whatsoever to do with the conflict in Ukraine. The WBC feel that they need to be seen to do the right thing. That's a whole different subject that I don't particularly want to get into on a boxing podcast. But in terms of Beterbiev and Bivol and that confusion about their Russian roots, they do represent and live in countries that are not Russia. Okay, and just one final news line coming out, and this is a slightly peculiar one, but the WBC have retroactively turned around a result from the 1990s between Jeff Fennick and Azuma Nelson. I think this is from June 91. Of course, they fought a couple of times. Now, they fought twice in the 91, 92, and then they fought again belatedly later into the new millennium. Do you want to explain this one to me? No, not really. I can understand it, and kind of, I've spent time with Maurizio Sulaiman, and he's a lovable figure. He always tries to do the right thing, and I just think their time would be better spent focused on the modern day. It's on the one hand, you can say it's a nice gesture, and if we're going to be honest, that Nelson Fenech fight, it was a horrendous decision that Nelson got a share of it. Horrendous. Fenech seemed to dominate. I think I don't know, I can't remember, but the general consensus at the time was that he'd won at least 8 or 9 rounds out of the 12. It was widely criticised as a bad, woeful, stinking, rotten decision at the time, but that was in 1991. And to go back and start awarding titles to fighters that were on the wrong end of very controversial decisions is opening up a can of worms of monstrous proportions. Because where do you stop with it? Jeff Fenech, I know, goes along to these WBC conventions. I actually interviewed Jeff Fenech. I sat down for 30 wondrous minutes with Jeff Fenech back in 2016 at a WBC convention in Miami. And Fenech was still effing and blinding and almost exploding about this decision. So I can imagine that he has been in Maurizio's ear about this particular decision on more than one occasion. It's a nice gesture. It's kind of a token gesture. But by announcing it at the convention that they're going to now call Fenech a WBC super featherweight champion, where does it stop? You'd need a whole new committee to start reviewing old fights and working out whether it was fair or unjust. Nice gesture on the surface, but a really tricky one to legislate if that's what they're going to be doing moving forward.
Yeah, especially with so much distance in between. I mean, obviously a recent example that springs to mind would be Jack Cattrall against Josh Taylor from last year. If you're going to look at it within a 6-month time frame or a 3-month time frame, a year maximum, and make a decision. Then that's and if you're going to order a rematch or whatever, that's something that's quite interesting, and that there's grounds for that, but it has to happen within a certain time frame. And as Matt says, this is odd. I think Maurizio's heart is in the right place. Just don't think he's particularly bright when it comes to applying it to certain situations. But anyway, that's a news line for you to folks to mull over, muse over, reflect on. That's Fenech Azumah-Nelson, the original draw from 1991. Right, let's just wrap up some other details from that bill in Abu Dhabi. Zelfa worn down late by Shavkatson Rakimov. Rakimov, who was a short price odds-on favourite to win that. Zelfa boxed well through the early rounds. Actually had Rakimov down with a fantastic uppercut. Zelfa couldn't miss with the uppercut throughout the early exchanges, and Rakimov was down in the 3rd round there. But ultimately, the fight turned around very, very quickly, didn't it, Matt, in the 9th round, where there was a shot that landed high on the forehead, and Zelfa Barrett's legs just seemed to capitulate, and all the energy seemed to drain out of him very, very quickly indeed. What did you make of that, the way it went from start to finish?
I thought Barrett was really impressive in the early going. When Rakimov went down in round 3, you start thinking, wow, this could be something absolutely sensational. This could be one of the great wins by a British fighter on foreign soil. But I must admit, and hand on heart, this is the way that I felt from about round 4 onwards, is that Rakimov was starting to get the measure of him from about round 4. And I must admit, even though Barrett was still doing well, and you could argue still winning the odd round, I felt that Rakimov had him figured out, and it did feel like it was going to be a matter of time. I didn't expect Barrett to suddenly capitulate in the manner that he did, but it wasn't a capitulation. I think he was working so hard to do what he was doing. I think, as Barry Jones kind of acutely pointed out on the co-commentary as well, is that Barrett, the way he was using his legs, and he was relying on his legs and being so energetic, that perhaps he was just exhausted from that approach. And when the punch landed that discombobulated him, there was nothing he could do. He wasn't out on his feet. I think if you'd have asked him any question in the world, he'd been able to answer it. But he just couldn't control his body as he wanted to. Rakhimov didn't look like a future superstar in the making, but I think that can be a lot of that is down to how Barrett approached that fight. Barrett showed that Rakhimov is not invincible, but Rakhimov in turn showed that he is a special fighter himself by emerging from quite a genuine crisis to win that fight in the manner that he did. Full credit to Barrett. And Rakhimov, we continue to watch with interest, but I don't think anybody's going to be absolutely certain when he goes into the fight with Joe Cordina next year that Rakhimov will win that. I think Rakhimov may enter it as a very, very narrow favourite, but Cordina's got every single chance of winning that fight, I think. Yeah,
I don't think Rakhimov was as good at the weekend as he normally is. Whether that was overconfidence and underestimating self, and maybe factored into it, he wasn't as technical or sensitive when he was going forward as he normally is. And in other words, what I'm saying is I think people who've seen Rakhimov before, we didn't see the best version of him at the weekend. And just because he was a bit off it through the first 4 or 5 rounds, that doesn't mean he's going to be in the same kind of form or shape when he fights Cordina.
No, and what you say there, you're right to say that, because he was fighting in the early rounds as if it was just a matter of time. I haven't necessarily got to be at my best. I haven't got to do all the things that I normally do to beat the guy that I'm in the ring with tonight. And it did speak of a bit of complacency, his performance through those opening few rounds. But there was, apart from that moment where he went down and very briefly when he regained his footing, he looked unsteady. Apart from that moment, there wasn't a moment where I felt that he was going to lose that fight. As good as Barrett looked, I didn't think that he was going to lose that fight.
No, we were on WhatsApp group, weren't we, watching the fight, and I think it was round 4 what I said, the pace is slowing. This is going to be interesting now, and I think you're right. Even although Zelfa was still boxing well, Rakhimov was building blocks. What you would say is if Rakhimov does turn up in the early rounds in the same kind of shape as he did against Zelfa Barrett, then there is every chance that Joe Cordina will knock him out, like he did, of course, with his previous opponent. And that looks a natural match, Rakhimov against Cordina, up next once Cordina's injury has been healed. What we did see from Chantelle Cameron, Matt, and I'm so pleased that she's put it all together against Jess McCaskill, we saw technique, game plan, more importantly, really when she needed it against a dangerous opponent, we saw discipline from Chantelle Cameron. She boxed to a plan all the way through and kept her shape all the way through. And ultimately, it was really quite comfortable and quite convincing. I think against, on the night, a disappointing and a poor version of Jess McCaskill.
Yeah, I mean, we were talking last week that we thought it might be the fight of the night. I thought Cameron did exactly what she had to do. She did show great discipline. She did show refrain. She didn't get involved. She didn't fight McCaskill's fight. She didn't get involved in the kind of exchanges and warfare that were really the only way that McCaskill could have won that fight, is if Cameron got careless. And McCaskill, whether she was off sorts, whether the drop down in weight didn't suit her, she wasn't the McCaskill that we've known. She's never been the most polished, let's be honest about it. And she was always there. She always made life uncomfortable. You only have to look at Chantelle Cameron's face at the end of it for evidence of that. But full credit for Chantelle Cameron for scoring what on paper is the best win of her career.
And, of course, who's in line for the Katie Taylor big night in Ireland next spring is much the talk in and around the weight division of, well, anything from 135, I suppose, to 140 and change. I suspect everyone's kind of throwing their name into to the ring. Of course, Serrano-Taylor rematch, it's not necessarily your choice one. It's mine, but it's not necessarily your choice one. It sounds like it might be for many in the Katie Taylor business, but it's not unthinkable that Chantelle Cameron could be in the running. given the closeness to the weight and given the dynamics of DAZN, etc. Interesting newsline coming out as well, Matt. I see the WBA have mandated that Serrano, they have discussions for her featherweight title with Erica Cruz. So that they had 30 days to agree on that, which will bring it up to around about December 1st. It's just a newsline that's slightly linked. Obviously, Serrano against Taylor would take place at lightweight, but it might just preempt some sort of move in that regard for Serrano's team about where it is that they're going to go and whether indeed Chantelle Cameron is an outside runner for the big gig next spring.
I think Chantelle Cameron is an outside runner, unfortunately. I'd like to see her fight Katie Taylor. She might even be my number one choice for Katie Taylor next year. But I doubt that is the fight that Katie Taylor will be looking at. As for the WBA ordering mandatories for Serrano, I said it last week that although it is refreshing to see so many fighters in the women's code fighting their closest rivals, because there are so many undisputed champions, they will have various sanctioning body mandatories that I don't think will take their career forward. It's not what they need at this particular time. And I'd rather see them fighting, having the best fights, creating the best events, rather than just kind of keeping sanctioning bodies happy. I mean, Chantelle Cameron has achieved an absolutely wondrous feat by winning all 4 belts. But if we're going to be a little bit cynical about it, 2 of those belts on Saturday night were vacant. That wouldn't happen in men's boxing. You wouldn't just get 2 sanctioning bodies lumping onto a fight just because it was kind of deemed noteworthy. But I do think for someone like Serrano, I think she has proved more than enough in her career and deserves the opportunity to do what she wants to do next, as opposed to kind of singing to the hymns that the sanctioning bodies are telling her to sing.
Let's move on then. This weekend, Saturday on Sky. Actually, Sonny Edwards fights on Friday, defending his world title, and on Saturday on Sky. There's a good bill in Manchester with Dalton Smith against Casey Benjamin is for the British title. First defence for Dalton Smith, who won it so impressively last time up against Sam O'Maison. I think this is the biggest test of both careers. I think it's a step up for Dalton Smith, and I think it's a step up for Casey Benjamin as well. Benjamin with a record of 16-1-1. Dalton Smith, 10 knockouts from 12. He's unbeaten. This is a really interesting matchup, Matt. I've commentated on Casey Benjamin before. This is a good fight.
It's a really good fight. Credit to Dalton Smith. After winning the British title, he now appears to be going down that route, that domestic route, making a defence of his British title against a very, very worthy opponent, very talented opponent, very dangerous opponent, very confident opponent in Casey Benjamin. I love the way Casey Benjamin fights. He's a little bit careless when he's on the way in, but he's quite flashy. He's a pressure fighter. He's got a lot of potential. This is not an easy night for Dalton Smith, but if Dalton Smith is the talent that we believe he is, you have to make him a fairly healthy favourite going into this fight. But full credit to him. He could have gone off down that route that other fighters are going off down, in terms of, as we've said before, kind of picking off odd, peculiar names that have a world ranking in order to secure some kind of world ranking themselves or heighten their world ranking with a sanctioning body. Dalton Smith going in with a British rival, and as a consequence, I believe this will be a much better spectacle. And top to bottom, this bill in Manchester on Saturday night, let's say top to bottom, there's four really solid matchups on this fight. There's Smith against Benjamin, Natasha Jonas against Marie Decaire, Tyler Denny against Bradley Ray could be a terrific little dust-up for the English middleweight title, and Fraser Clark belatedly gets the first test that's befitting of his talents in the shape of Sokolowski, that old heavyweight veteran who can be and has been a bit of a banana skin for fighters on the way up.
Yeah, Big Paul, who's based in Britain. Clark having his 4th fight. And although he's 36 now, Sokolowski, generally he goes the distance, doesn't he? And he's done that with guys like Otto Wallen not that long ago. Solomon Deckers as well, another up-and-coming fighter. And, you wind the clock back even further. David Price went the distance with Sokolovsky. He was stopped by Big Jalalov, wasn't he? Was that just a couple of fights ago? But normally he goes the distance. So that is, it's been a checkered start to his career. Not much of it through his own doing, Fraser Clark. Whether it's been the matchmaking, bit of bad luck here and there. A farce thrown in for bad measure, but this finally, I think Fraser Clark's got an opponent he can get his teeth into, and he deserves that, Clark, and let's hope he gets the test and we get a good fight, and he gets the opportunity, more importantly, to show the fans what he's all about, because his heart and his ability are definitely in the right place. And I think at the weekend we get a chance to see that. Back to Dalton Smith against Casey Benjamin. The one thing you didn't say about Benjamin on the way up, which I thought surely would be the first thing that slips off your tongue, he's from Brum, isn't he, mate?
He is. He is. What a city. What a city.
Yeah, I called his 2020 fight against Shaquille Day down in Brentwood. Really good fight, actually. Little 10-rounder. And that night, that's when Benjamin was fighting as a welterweight. And that day, Shaquille Day came in... What did he come in? He came in about 153 or 155. He was way overweight. And credit to Benjamin, because he carried on. He took the fight on, even although he was kind of outweighed. It was a really good fight too that night. And obviously he's now fighting down at 140. Now, you'll look on his record and think, oh my goodness me, that's a big jump down. He did make weight, Matt, earlier on this year at 140, but unfortunately the fight, because of something to do with his opponent, it didn't end up operating at 140, but he did make weight at 140 the day before. So he has had the experience of making 140 pounds, even although officially you won't have seen him fight at super light welterweight in Old Murray. So that's going to be intriguing, because in terms of styles, this is a really good matchup. I think they're both natural counter punchers. Benjamin's quite explosive, probably throws single punches more than combinations. We know Dalton Smith is an excellent counter puncher. So I think Smith's got the more polish, but I think Benjamin can hit. He's explosive, and I think he could cause a few problems. I'm expecting quite an explosive fight, and I wouldn't be surprised if somehow it's over in about 4 or 5 rounds.
Yeah, it wouldn't be a surprise. I mean, you mentioned the weight there. He has fought as low as 141 officially in November 2021 against Andreas Mayer, which was non-title 8-rounder. But it's perfectly valid to ask the question, how comfortable will he be when it actually comes to being in the ring in a championship fight against Dalton Smith? Dalton Smith is not the first unbeaten fighter that Benjamin has come across, and he's taken several unbeaten records. You mentioned there Shaquille Day, also Levi Ferguson, Danny Ball. I think his toughest fight was arguably against Ben Fields back in 2020, December 2020. Ben Fields, another Midlander, whose record really doesn't do him justice, Ben Fields, and Benjamin came through a really tough night there back in that was in Redditch. I think if you look at footage of Smith and you look at footage of Benjamin, they're both very natural fighters. They're both impressive fighters, but I do think that you can pick holes in Benjamin in a way that you can't pick holes in Dalton Smith. Benjamin has a tendency when he's coming in to be too square on, and I've seen that in more than one fight where he gets a little bit excited about the opening in front of him and leads himself open as well, opens up the space, opens up the target zone to his opponents, and someone like Dalton Smith, if they are exchanging, could really take advantage of that. Something with Dalton Smith that's really impressed me is just he appears to have that calm mindset that's so important for fighters at the very top level, and Dalton Smith just seems to have that naturally. And although Benjamin is, I suppose, what you could term a live underdog, I would still be very surprised if it wasn't Dalton Smith that won this fight.
Yeah, I think that's fair. 5-1 against, by the way, Casey Benjamin. 1-9, Dalton Smith, heavy favourite to win this one. I think Benjamin's just a little too loose while he is explosive. I think Dalton Smith has got... he's a bit special, isn't he? He could be a bit special. And he uses class, but he's quite smooth and polished with his combinations. I think he's just a bit tighter and classier and more polished. And I think in those exchanges, he might just have the final word. And I wouldn't be surprised if he wins by knockout again. But Benjamin's a live one. Are you expecting Jonas to beat Decaire? Is this more of a test for Jonas than she's had previously in her 2 title fights at this weight, around this weight?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's the best opponent she's faced up at super welterweight. Decaire, her only fight really of note is that she lost pretty much every round when she fought Clarissa Shields, but she has been in with some solid opposition that, say, perhaps more casual fans won't recognise. Decaire is a good fighter, good solid fighter, far from unbeatable. And I think the manner in which Shields beat Decaire so convincingly, Decaire can get, again, ragged on the inside, open to punches going through the middle, and Shields exploited that perfectly. And I think Jonas will take some educated chances on the inside to get her punches through. What we don't know about Jonas at this weight is whether her punch power has carried through. I don't think a stoppage of Decaire is completely out of the question, but I would expect to see Jonas win a 10-round decision. Not a whitewash necessarily, but maybe 7-3, something along those lines. And then, of course, all sorts of possibilities open up for Jonas. Will there be that super fight with Clarissa Shields? That's being talked about. And I think Jonas does have the name to perhaps attract Shields back to the UK, or even Jonas to go over to the US. Will there be the rematch against Terry Harper, who, of course, is now operating in that division? There's a lot of choices out there if Jonas gets past this fight. And I think full credit, really, to Natasha Jonas. I remember talking to her on an old podcast about how she was kind of facing oblivion, wasn't she, after she turned professional. And then she'd lost that fight in 2018, and she was stopped. And she said, I'd never lost like that before against Obernuth. And she was wondering whether she would ever achieve what she wanted to achieve. I remember her being in the Manchester hotel the night after she'd lost a close fight to Katie Taylor, but deservedly lost. And she was saying to people, I just don't think it's going to happen for me. So full credit to her for coming back, full credit to the way that Ben Shalom has really worked a promotional masterstroke to get her to be a legitimate contender and belt holder in the super welterweight class. And I think Jonas, if she wins this, she could really move forward and have perhaps the biggest fight of her life in the fight after this. And
I wonder if it's any coincidence, Matt, that when you think of two of the, you think of that storyline, that career storyline that you're talking about with Jonas, and then your mind wanders to the career storyline of Anthony Crawler as well, where a level seemed to have been reached in both of their boxing lives. Disappointments had come their way in both of their boxing lives. And yet through perseverance, sheer hard work, sheer determination, maybe stubbornness in both of their careers, and maybe just with the influence of a certain Joe Gallagher as well, the link between the two of them. Maybe that's no coincidence at all, is it? But it says a great deal for both of them through that link, that they've managed to persevere. And two of the, if you're any fighter coming up these days who faces difficulty, who finds obstacles in the road, Jonas and Crawler are the two stories you look to for inspiration.
It's a hugely inspirational story. Crawler as well, likewise. Crawler will tell you about, I forget, was it Gary Sykes or someone like that he lost to on a 10-round points decision when he was on the way up, and I think it was for an English title, and he thought that was it. All he was dreaming of at that point was a British title, and he thought that was elusive, and he went back and he joined forces with Joe Gallagher, and then he went on to achieve what he went on to achieve. He was, up until a few years ago, if he wasn't everybody's favourite fighter, he was at least their second favourite fighter. And he's a joy to spend time with. But Crolla went back and he dedicated himself. And yes, he is testament to the quality of trainer Joe Gallagher, who we said in a recent episode isn't quite the front and centre figure that he used to be. That's a conscious decision from Joe, I believe. But he remains one of, if not the best trainer in this country, and he's one of the best trainers in the world, Joe Gallagher. His achievements speak for themselves. I think if you were to put all the CVs of all the British trainers alongside each other, Joe Gallagher's would be the one that would be the most impressive.
Final word before we move on to this week. How tough is the assignment that Denzel Bentley has on his radar as he goes to Vegas? I think that's on BT Sport. He's fighting Janibek Cameron, of course, who slammed Danny Dignam, another Brit, just in a couple of rounds last time up. This time it's for the full WBO middleweight title. Bentley, who beat Marcus Morrison last time up. And Morrison, another Joe Gallagher fighter, really did try and put it on Bentley, didn't he? And Bentley kind of fought fire with fire and came through a potential mini crisis, same kind of crisis that had unfolded against Felix Cash last year when he lost in 3 rounds. How big a jump up is this for Denzel Bentley? Is he good enough?
I think every time that we start hearing about Lloyd Hoonigan's win over Donald Curry in the build-up to a fight that involves a British fighter on American soil suggests that it's perceived as Mission Impossible, and that does seem to be the perception here. We know about Denzel Bentley. We know what a good fighter he is at British level, but he is taking a huge step up here. It's not a step up like Lloyd Hoonigan took there. Let's put it into perspective. Lloyd Hoonigan was going in against the best pound-for-pound fighter of that time when Lloyd Hoonigan went and did what he did to Donald Curry all those years ago. It's not that size of jump, but it's a really difficult ask for Zelfa Barrett. In the same way that that's what I was about to say. It's a really difficult ask for Denzel Bentley in the same way that it was a really difficult ask for Zelfa Barrett. Zelfa Barrett surprised us. Will Denzel Bentley? He may. I don't expect him to get outclassed and wiped out like Danny Dignam was, for example. But I think that by rounds 4 or 5 or 6, it's going to be very clear that he can't win the fight.
Cameron against Bentley this weekend. That's in Vegas. Next, we're going to take you to Arlington, Texas. We're going to take you back to 2010 in this week. Yeah, this week we take you back to the 13th of November 2010 at the Cowboys Stadium in Arlington. Manny Pacquiao breaking new ground in his stadium fight against Antonio Margarito. Nominally, this was at 154 pounds. Pacquiao, who had gone up some 40 or so pounds in the weights over the years since he started his career. And this latest assignment was billed as largely being about size. He weighed in, Matt, at 144 pounds, not even at the welterweight limit. Margarito, who had boiled himself down to 150 himself under the 154 limit so that he could bulk back up again. And on the night, Margarito weighed in at a whopping 165 pounds. Pacquiao, not even only just a welterweight in the ring that evening, was in against a super middleweight. Size literally isn't everything in boxing. And little Manny Pacquiao showed it on this night. I think one of his best career performances.
I think it was probably the last performance of peak Manny Pacquiao. I think it was at a catch weight of 150 pounds. So I think Margarito had to weigh in at 150 pounds. But yeah, on the night, the size difference was striking, wasn't it? I went back and I looked at Boxing News the week before this fight took place. It was the same weekend, of course, that David Haye and Audley Harrison went together in the UK with their unforgettable farce. But the better fight, of course, was over in Arlington, at the Cowboy Stadium, one of the best stadiums I've ever visited. So very impressive. But the question was, is this a good fight for boxing? Boxing News were posing that at the time. And of course it was because Margarito was 2 years removed from the fight against Shane Mosley, where before that fight that he lost, his hand wraps were found to have an illegal substance in them, which hardened them, and he was then punished. And the suggestion was that despite the fact that he had served a suspension, he was then coming in and earning the most handsome payday of his entire career so soon after breaking the rules so flagrantly. So there was a suggestion, is this a good fight for boxing? But at this time, almost any fight that involved Manny Pacquiao was a good fight for boxing. He was an astonishing fighter. Watching this as he kind of just raids Margarito from all angles, and Margarito can't do anything with him, is truly incredible to watch. And you watch Pacquiao here and you watch Pacquiao in more recent years, and you can see that very pronounced decline in the great fighter that he was. He'd fought against Joshua Clottey about 8 months before, hadn't he, in the very, very same arena. On that night against Joshua Clottey, 51,000 people were in attendance. There was actually 10,000 less in attendance to watch this fight against Margarito, which did suggest that the appetite was perhaps not there for the villainous Margarito, but nonetheless, this still attracted $64 million in worldwide pay-per-view revenue.
Oh, Pacquiao was must-watch TV, wasn't he, around that time? That period, particularly 2008 to 2010, when he had just routed and raced over Oscar De La Hoya, Hatton, and then Cotto in quick succession. Those three fights, 2008, 2009, Oscar De La Hoya, Hatton, and then Cotto. Just Pacquiao, I think at his best. And we saw most of that against Margarito, who really did show his courage on this night more than anything else, Matt, didn't he? Just sheer bravery and courage, because he gave Pacquiao difficulty with his size and his sheer will. The jab. There were moments in most rounds where he was giving Pacquiao just some slight problems just by his sheer presence and size. But Pacquiao was just phenomenal on this night. The speed and the power, Matt. How he gets, often the power comes from the speed, but Pacquiao constantly throws shots while he's on the move. He'll dip that right shoulder and he'll sling in the straight left, and it's just subtle moves. He's never really twisting from the hips, transferring the weight from the back foot to the front foot. He's not transferring power in the way that a golfer would do, in the way that the boxers normally do. And yet he gets so much power through the speed. A very, very unusual fighter, a very special fighter, Pacquiao. And I think on this night, with all that speed and movement, you get a real sense of what it was that made him must watch and made him so good.
Do you know what? When I watch Pacquiao go back and watch Pacquiao around this particular point of his career, I must admit there's a tinge of sadness when I watch it, just because you think, well, what would have happened if he'd have fought Floyd Mayweather at this point? And, we can say that when fights don't happen, it's okay, we move on, we forget about it. I think on this occasion, we don't forget about it. We won't forget about it. We won't forget about Pacquiao's failure, Mayweather's failure, the promoter's failure, the broadcaster's failure, the sport's failure to make the fight at the right time. This fight against Margarito, Freddie Roach beforehand was saying that it'd be Manny Pacquiao's worst camp. He said, but even Pacquiao's worst camp is likely to be better than any other fighter's best camp. He said he's still been so very dedicated. He went over to the wild card, he was training in the Philippines, then he went to the wild card just 3 weeks before the fight. And this, of course, was a time where Pacquiao had just undertaken his new role as a congressman, and he got that role in May 2010. And there was a lot fizzing round in the world of Manny Pacquiao at this particular point in time. There was talk about the Floyd Mayweather super fight. Is it going to happen? Can it happen? Mayweather himself was in trouble. He was facing that jail time for domestic abuse. But Daniel Herbert kind of summed it up. He was ringside for this fight for Boxing News. And he said, if Pacquiao's life is a storm, then the boxing ring is its eye. A place where he is in control, where he has the time to think and make the decisions he wants to make. That's very, very true. At this point in time, Pacquiao was never more comfortable than in a boxing ring. And, you know, we speak about Dimitri Bivol with it all coming so very, very naturally. In a different way, it came so very naturally to Manny Pacquiao. But he had to work hard to get the best from himself. At this particular point in time, I'd have given him every chance of beating Floyd Mayweather. And I stand by that now, even knowing what actually occurred in 2015 when they eventually got round to fighting each other.
Oh, this 2010, 2008, 2009, 2010 version of Pacquiao definitely had a chance. Whether he'd have beaten Mayweather's defence and finding a way, who knows. But Pacquiao threw so many punches and was so explosive at this particular period in his career. At a time when Mayweather was 41-0, by the way, back in 2010. 5 years later, it would be when they finally fought. And Pacquiao nowhere near the same tour de force that he was on this occasion. The tour de force that had Jim Lampley commentating ringside for HBO, describing Pacquiao as the best offensive fighter he's ever seen. And that included his time calling Sugar Ray Leonard ringside. Lampley saying Pacquiao, the best offensive fighter I've ever seen. And the great late Manny Stewart describing Manny Pacquiao as one of the best natural fighters that he'd ever seen. One of the best, according to Manny Stewart. A couple of interesting stats on this night, Matt. They both, I'm not a believer in the punch counting and the compy box and all of that, but apparently, I think it was rounds 4 and round 8. I think round 4, Pacquiao landed the most punches in a round that Margarito had ever taken. And then I think later on, it was in the 8th, Margarito landed the most punches on Pacquiao in a round that Pacquiao had ever taken. And it gives you a real sense of, although this was a one-sided, what the Americans would call beatdown, scores of 119 to 109 twice, 120 to 108 once as well. It was a dominant, effervescent performance from Pacquiao, striking constantly again and again and again. Margarito's right eye damaged from the 4th round onwards. His nose and his left eye damaged later on in the fight as well. He was a bloody bruised mess as this fight unfolded, Margarito, and yet still was always in there throwing punches, always trying to find a way. But there was no way to beat Pacquiao on this side. There was no way at all.
No, there wasn't. Margarito showed guts aplenty, and probably doesn't get the credit for the guts that he showed in this particular fight, purely as a consequence of what went on beforehand, in years beforehand, in terms of, I mean, once he was found with those illegal hand wraps, he was a villain forevermore. He'll be a villain until the day he dies, Antonio Margarito. But he was still a really good fighter. And Pacquiao, at times, made it look so very easy. But the sustained hammering he took, Margarito, ended him as a top-level fighter. Okay, he somehow managed to secure the Miguel Cotto rematch. The storyline was craving for that rematch, wasn't it? But there was a lot of suggestion that fight shouldn't have happened, that the state of Margarito's eye, he shouldn't have been anywhere near a boxing ring at that particular point in time. And you wonder, did the level of effort required to turn in that masterclass against Margarito affect Pacquiao? I mean, after this fight, Pacquiao then went into a fight with Shane Mosley, where he was not remotely impressive, or not by his own high standards. Then he had the yet another tricky fight with Juan Manuel Marquez, and then he had the fight with Timothy Bradley, which he lost very contentiously, I hasten to add. But I think we can say that this was the last time that we saw Pacquiao, that invincible monster that we believed he was. Interesting fight to watch. It's one-sided, but it is Pacquiao is mesmerising best.
Yeah, I think you watch back and enjoy this, folks, to watch back and enjoy Pacquiao. It also is, I suppose, a kind of timepiece in history, isn't it? Given what had happened with Margarito and Mosley before, after the 16-month break from 2020, when the late Nazim Richardson, of course, spotted the plaster of Paris powder when the hands were getting wrapped in Margarito's dressing room beforehand. That was back in 2020, and 16 months out of the ring. It's a kind of timepiece in history, one of the sort of sad episodes in boxing history, of course. And you can't help but feel that both in this fight and in the Mosley fight, I watched that back as well, Matt, the Mosley fight against Margarito. I mean, Mosley, that's probably one of the last great performances by Shane Mosley, really. You see the number... Oh, you see the number of right, fast, explosive right hands. Mosley looked good in that fight, actually. I'd forgotten how good he looked there, Mosley. He was like winding back the clock a little bit. But the number of right hands, like huge, thunderous knockout right hands, Mosley exploded off Margarito's head. And 2 out of 3 fights in a row, Margarito took an absolute pummeling. Ultimately, he was stopped by Mosley. He should have been stopped by Pacquiao. You may recall, Matt, it was in the 11th round. Pacquiao beckoned on more than one occasion, glanced to Lawrence Cole, the referee, as if to say, what's going on here? What more do I have to do? And he backed off in the 12th round, Pacquiao, didn't he? He just kind of shut down and didn't go after Margarito as he had done previously, almost feeling sorry for him, feeling sorry for the villain of the piece coming into this fight. Gives you an idea of the punishment that Margarito took, and surely the kind of punishment that left some kind of mark. That's Pacquiao against Margarito from 2010, a special night, special performance from Manny Pacquiao, enjoyed by Jim Lampley and by Manny Stewart ringside on the night. Thanks for tuning in, folks. We'll be back again next week for more of the same. Bye for now.